Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Molinari. I'm the Communications and Programming Officer at Columbia Global Centers here in Santiago, Chile. On behalf of the Global Center and our partner, the Institute for Disaster Resilience, ITREND, I would like to welcome you to our event. Thank you all for coming. The 21st century has brought its share of disturbing events and possibilities. Pandemics, climate change, infrastructure collapse, cyberattacks, nuclear conflict. How can we prepare for this and prevent these disasters from happening? It's my pleasure today to introduce Jeff Schlegelmilch, who's the director of the director of Columbia Climate School's National Center for Disaster Preparedness. I'd like to thank Jeff for coming today. He brought a gift with him. He came all the way from New York and he brought some rain with him. So maybe he should come down more often. He will be talking to us today and presenting his book, Rethinking Readiness, which invites us to reimagine how we approach disaster preparedness. He'll be discussing this matter with Magdalena Gil, a Columbia alumna and associate at ITREND, and a researcher at the National Research Center for Integrated Disaster Risk Management, CIGIREN. Please join me in welcoming Jeff and Magdalena.
Turn it. Yeah, you can hear me now? Okay. It's not much worth hearing anyway. All right. Where's my clicker? All right. Muchas gracias por venir esta mañana. Me disculpo, mi español no es suficiente para mi presentación. No sé por qué. Yo estudio español y después de muchos años yo sé 15 más palabras. Y 14 de esas son tipos de comidas. Actually, I learned a new word with the rain. Sopapillas? Sopapillas. So I'm trying. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. Let me start out. I'm going to go back and forth between some of the text in the book and kind of some broader themes, and really interested in the discussion and talking with all of you after. But to start, and as the book starts, disasters impact lives first and foremost, whether in the direct fatalities and injuries they cause, the struggles that survivors face to rebuild while the rest of the world moves on, or the long-term mental and physical health impacts that linger but are rarely addressed properly. It is people, families, and communities that are forever altered by a disaster. But the impact of the disaster rarely persists beyond those people and places directly affected for long. 24-hour news cycles and social media bring quick attention when disaster strikes. We're captivated by the stories of heroism and tragedy, and we obsess over numbers and statistics. How many were killed? How many homes were destroyed? How many people are displaced? How long until life is back to normal? Donations pour in into the disaster aid industry via text messages, telethons, and social media campaigns. And with the press of a button, we've made a difference. And as quickly as the attention comes, the news cameras then move on to their next story, along with our attention and our compassion. But the survivors cannot just move on. Their world is disrupted by disaster. All sense of safety and security vanishes, and support networks are disrupted as recovery begins. A new normal needs to be defined within a cacophony of destruction and displacement. Survivors need to get used to the scattershot of nonprofits and government agencies that are there to help. The effects of a disaster can continue to impact a community and the individual survivors for years, even generations after the disaster itself. Some are able to rebuild, while others get stuck in a perpetual cycle of loss. Disasters also exacerbate inequality. We have seen time after time that the quality of recovery and access to services in response and recovery are often predictable by socioeconomic factors like race, income, and ethnicity. New frontiers in disaster research are expanding on concepts like social capital and social cohesion, or how well connected we are to each other. This research is further describing how those connections and your connectivity with your community is ultimately connected to the disaster recovery. But this book is not about the impact of disasters on individuals or even larger communities. It's about how disasters can disrupt broader societal trajectories. The origins of this book came from really a friend, a colleague, a mentor, Dr. Erwin Redlener, who's the founder of the center that I now direct. And we had this idea that there are these different categories of disasters as we go into the 21st century that have the potential to dramatically alter the trajectory of human development. Further, these categories of disasters are driven by our development, our activity. And so in this process, I grabbed my clicker, I forgot it. We're looking at how our activity is exacerbating the threats and the vulnerabilities. So in each of these categories, biothreats, climate change, critical infrastructure, cyber threats, nuclear conflict, there are things where our activity, our development is both increasing the threat, increasing the severity of the challenges that we're facing, and also making us more vulnerable to them. I'm going to skip biothreats for now. Clearly, it's not really relevant. It's relevant. I was just joking. And so with climate change is one of these areas, right? I know it's an area of intense focus here in Chile, intense focus throughout the world. It's the easiest example. Here we are pouring greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, creating some understood, some yet to be fully understood impacts on weather and climate around us. We don't necessarily know if we're going to see more storms, but the storms that we do see will be more intense. We're seeing more unpredictable weather. I heard there was a tornado in Chile, and that doesn't really happen. We had a cold snap in Texas, which you think of global warming, you think, oh, well, everything's going to get hotter, but with this unpredictability, you get these patterns. And of course, heat and drought. We're actually having dinner last night with some colleagues, and we were talking about how drought is one of these things that it's not very photogenic. It's not an acute disaster like an earthquake where you have a rubble pile you can report the news in front of. But when we talk about this, when we talk about heat and drought, these are the ones that we're actually the most worried about. These slow-moving disasters permanently alter communities. I want to read a passage. A colleague, Adam Sobel, is a professor at Columbia University and leads a lot of research into climate change and was interviewed as part of this book. And there's a section in climate change where we talk about security implications. So we talk about damage from disasters and things like that, but there's this massive national security component as a result of climate change. The US Department of Defense has been considering climate change in the context of national security, and they affect the facilities maintained by the military, domestic, and globally. These facilities are likely to see increased flooding, loss of land due to flooding, with as many as 2/3 of installations threatened by climate change in the next 20 years. A recent report also sees the risk to fragile states facing increased pressure from the effects of climate change. I want to talk about this one and the impacts on immigration and the impacts of global migration, leading to destabilization of nation states and even entire regions. Climate change factors may also increase pressures for US military intervention abroad. The impact of prolonged drought has been suggested as a contributing cause of the Syrian civil war. In the analysis, the most severe drought in the Fertile Crescent was experienced just prior to the outbreak of conflict. Of course, this is not. This is in concert with poor governance and unsustainable agricultural policies as it relates to food security and a complex array of other non-environmental governance issues. Still, it is reasonable to posit that in areas of extreme climate sensitivity and underlying weakness in infrastructure and governance, climate change is contributing to state instability, with the potential for cascading impacts across the region and across the globe. And governmental instability and military conflict as consequences of climate change are not confined to Syria. And Adam Sobel says, some places like the Sahel and Africa and some other places could become almost uninhabitable in the future. Think about that for a minute. Large portions of our planet, millions of people living in, being virtually uninhabitable, can't sustain agriculture, have wet bulb temperatures, combinations of heat and humidity. What does this do to global migration? What does this do at our borders? In the United States, there's a lot of concern right now with the southern border. And our immigration policies were built on economic development, bringing in the workforce, expansion, and growth. We have an influx of refugees from other parts of the world for various reasons. I'll let the pundits talk about the politics. But there's a fundamental question not being asked. Our current stance on immigration is built on a lens that is not relevant for what we're confronting. We're not ready for it. And how do we combine compassion with the sheer volume of people that will be coming? I don't have answers, just questions. Every aspect of national security, here's Adam continues. There's going to be disasters like storms and floods, but some of the biggest changes of global significance, I think, are going to come from heat, drought, and crop failure, leading to mass migration and the conflict that grows out of it. After climate change, we talk about critical infrastructure failures. And so here's another area, critical infrastructure. We've been doing a lot of work with utilities, and I had the pleasure of meeting with a number of members of the private sector as well, too, in my time here, and how, modern life is made possible by infrastructure, right? And in fact, if you look at the improvements in health and the reductions in death over the last 100 years, a little bit of it is attributable to things like antibiotics and vaccines, some of it to increased healthcare access and things like that. But by and large, the vast majority are to improvements in sanitation and improvements in nutrition, both made possible by supply chains, transportation networks, electricity, utilities. The challenge is that we become reliant on this. We become connected with all of this infrastructure, but it's not exciting to maintain it. It's not exciting to say, we're going to repave this road so that we can keep sending 1,000 trucks a day over it. What's the next big project? What's the next new project? And so what we end up with is this cycle where we invest in kind of the next big thing, but don't put the investments in what we need. And so we see near misses. We'll see a bridge collapse, and that'll be, we got to look at other bridges. We had a building collapse in Miami. And then all of a sudden, the other buildings were looked at. And an example I give in the book is the Oroville Dam in California. So a lot of the dams in the United States and really throughout the world were built when there were less people living downstream of them. I think at the time there were around 40,000 people living downstream. Today it's more than 200,000, or maybe just less. It's about 200,000, más o menos. But so there was heavy rains, heavy snowfall, and they said it's not going to collapse. We have this spillway, and then they one night they had what we call, as a very technical term in the disaster business, an oh shit moment. They realized, oh shit, we need to evacuate. So they start to evacuate, and then all these stories come out on when they built the town, there was only one evacuation route. You have this great picture of headlights and taillights stuck on the one road coming out. And, it's a very dramatic story. Spoiler alert, the dam didn't collapse. Sorry, when my sister and I were kids, we would go to this place in Colorado, and we were kids, so we couldn't say bad words. But there was this store by the dam, and it always said, the best dam store. And so every time we drove by, 10 years, we'd say, is that the dam store? Yeah, it's the best dam store. Anyway, sorry, a little trip down memory lane. Thank you for coming with me. But we look back on that, and we look at that, and actually all the reports were there on structural insufficient dams and the populations below. And it's not just about reinforcing the dam, it's having the options for evacuation. It's socializing that among the people. And I think back on that too, and I think, what we didn't talk about, if that dam had collapsed, and let's say by some miracle, everybody got out, we now have 200,000 internally displaced people in the United States with no domestic plan on how to manage that. We're good at managing it overseas. Well, we have plans for managing it overseas. Maybe that's what I should say. But within the country, it's not something we think about. Why in the US would we have that sort of need? Flint, Michigan is the other example given in the book, where you have, for a variety of different decisions, an entire community that can't drink the water with children in it. And our director at the time, Dr. Erwin Redlener, a children's advocate, said, look, if you can't fix this, you need to evacuate the town. Otherwise, you are keeping children in harm's way unnecessarily. So we're seeing these hints of how infrastructure can have outsized effects, and how from the lack of investments, we're not investing in them. I'm going to read a little bit from this just to talk about, this is a section titled, Why Infrastructure Resilience is So Hard. It is exciting to build things, to cut ribbons and debut the future. However, maintaining infrastructure is expensive, time-consuming, and sometimes less compelling to the public and politicians. Complex regulations, interest group priorities, and cost-sharing across numerous public sector entities, private sector companies, quasi-public utilities, the military, community organizations, and so forth, create a cacophony of agendas. Still, in the face of catastrophic disaster, we expect them to all operate in harmony. In discussing the layers of agencies overseeing infrastructure, so George Theodatos is with the Climate School and with the School of Engineering at Columbia University, and is a civil engineer. And so he says, there are components of, and specifically about New York City, there are components of the infrastructure controlled by the city, other parts are controlled by New York State, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and of course the private sector. All of these elements add confusion, making it difficult to make the best use of available funds with maximum efficiency. He later notes that infrastructure isn't built all at once. And he says, if you consider a major metropolitan area like New York, the infrastructure has been built over a century or more. He also pointed out that generally the kind of major investment of infrastructure only happens, and this is a quote, when it becomes a matter of life and death, or when we are forced to respond to a disaster. He elaborated that in countries like the Netherlands, there was not sufficient political support for major flood control projects until after the country experienced significant loss of life and property damage. In his own words, he says, sometimes it takes a catastrophe to act, and that's very unfortunate. I think in some of the conversations we've had in the time that folks have given us here in Chile, we see similar trends, right? Where a lot of the agencies are working extraordinarily hard with the resources available to do the most that's absolutely possible. But it's after things like the 2010 earthquake and tsunami that a lot of the political will and a lot of the resources start to become available to do it. Cyber threats. I'm going to read a quote to you. And I want to take a guess on when it was written. Remember that in the future, computing power will be readily available to everyone, either as a small personal machine or as a personal console. The computer will certainly be useful to society in combating crime, but might it not also help the criminal plan his crime or the large criminal organization manage his affairs? There was another quote in here on data. I'm going to paraphrase because I lost my sticky note. The same person also said, today there are large amounts of data being accumulated by organizations, and we can't take for granted that the methods of regulating and securing that information are sufficient for the volume of data that's being collected. Any thoughts on when that quote was made? Who thinks 1990 or later? 1980 or later? 1970? It was in 1967. This quote was in 1967. I found these papers. They were actually very cool. They were declassified Army ARPA papers from the RAND Corporation, written on a typewriter. And they were scanned in, and they had the stamps, the classification stamps. And there were a couple of papers written by this gentleman, Willis Ware, about things like the amount of data that was being collected and that was planned on being collected. It's like, you should have played the lottery. Virtually most of the predictions came true in terms of the increase in computing power, the size of computing, and all of the challenges we face with data management. And most importantly, talks a lot about the insufficiency of regulations, that we're always a step behind in the amount of data that we're collecting and capturing. The internet and the connectedness that we have, the miracle of this connection is that it's decentralized. Everyone is sort of a part owner of the internet and the information that's out there. The challenge that this creates is that we're all responsible for the security of it. We're all responsible for an increasingly complex ecosystem. And some of the things we talk about in the book, we talk about how it's being used by the military and the intelligence community, how it creates a new front in global conflict. We're watching some of the things we're not hearing as much about in Ukraine and with Russia are the underlying cyber attacks. Most of the time now, before an initial invasion, there's a cyber attack to bring down a lot of the defensive systems. But then we think of things like in a healthcare environment, the Internet of Things, all these things we connect. I'm afraid after I say this, all of you are going to go home and disconnect your devices. But one of the things we found, so healthcare systems are especially prone to ransomware, where you can go in and lock up the data and you have to pay a ransom to release it. And healthcare, and there are certain industries that are very prone because they have a lot of data and they can't handle any downtime without there being risk to life or the survival of the business. And in healthcare, so you have very, very secure systems, but then you may have like a medication delivery machine that plugs into that network. That machine comes with a standard administrative password on all of the machines for doing maintenance. And the minute it's plugged into the system, you can get into this very secure system through an unsecure piece of equipment that's plugged into it. And so for a lot of years, there was this question we see with things like moving to electronic voting machines and now getting into the realm of misinformation, being able to use things like social media, get to the underlying psychology and really weaponizing information to help drive political agendas. And I think we're all experiencing and frustrated with what we refer to as increased polarization. And finally, because I think I haven't left you with enough to be worried about, I want to talk about nuclear conflict. This is kind of a, I originally wasn't going to put this in the book. And I was talking with Erwin about nuclear, because I said, it's over. Cold War's over. We don't have to worry. I mean, we kind of have to worry about nuclear weapons, but we got a lot of stuff to worry about. Why should I write about this? And he convinced me, and I talked with him and some other experts, and some of them are interviewed in the book, that the threat of nuclear war is probably more present now than it's ever been. But the survivability is also greater. So during the Cold War, we had these global killing arsenals, massive amounts of nuclear weapons pointed at each other. One launched, it's all gone. Don't bother preparing. It's a waste of time and money. I was talking with someone in the financial industry, and we were talking, and what do you do when stocks are dropping because of the threat of nuclear war? And the advice is buy them, because one of two things is going to happen. The bombs are going to fly, and we're all going to be dead anyway. Or they're not going to fly, and it's going to go back up. So, yeah, I don't have better. I'm not a financial advisor, so please don't hold me accountable for that. But that's the general trend. Some states, Washington State in the United States, they actually passed a law forbidding preparedness for nuclear conflict because this is a waste of time and money and conversation. Now we're in a situation where we have a lot smaller nation states. We used to have these big sort of centers of gravity, the Soviet Union and the United States, and everyone sort of aligned with one or the other, and you pointed your missiles at the other. Now we have terrorist organizations, we have smaller nation states, we have the opportunities for regional nuclear conflict at a smaller scale. And so we still don't want a nuclear war, but it's much more survivable. So certain actions like staying inside for 24 hours before the fallout settles could actually save hundreds of thousands of lives. But then the environmental consequences of even a small scale use of 10 nuclear weapons or so of the kiloton variety, the smaller ones, could put us into, we hear about nuclear winter from the Cold War. There's this new term, nuclear autumn, right, where you have severe disruptions in food supplies, severe movement of people across the globe. But it's something we don't talk about because we're sort of attuned to this Cold War style of global killing when there's actually a lot of actions that can be taken. I'm going to read for you the introduction to this chapter. If you happen to be in relatively close proximity to a nuclear weapon detonation, and need to rapidly evaluate what to do next, the good news is you're not dead. Okay. If you happen to survive the blast but receive a lethal dose of radiation, a highly unlikely situation, soon you'll start to feel the onset of acute radiation sickness, ultimately leading to death. The same is true for severe burns, non-survivable traumatic injuries. Otherwise, if none of that's happened, you are now in a very survivable situation if you take proper precautions. The first step is to get to a place where you'll be protected from the radioactive fallout contained in the mushroom cloud that will shortly descend to the ground level. It's floating above you right now. Specifically, from the blinding flash of light followed by an extraordinary blast, you'll have about 20 minutes to find shelter as far as you can away from ground zero. Ideally, you'll want to get somewhere with layers of concrete between you and the outside world. Windows and cars, while better than being out in the open, will not provide very much protection from the radiation. A center room of a basement or a higher floor near the center of the building should work, but not too close to the roof. Radioactive particles will be settling there as well. After that, change your clothes, place them somewhere away from you in a sealed garbage bag. Your clothes are probably covered in radioactive dust. Take a shower if you can, and then wait about 24 hours. After about 24 hours, 80% of the radiation will have decayed, making it relatively safe to evacuate. Local emergency responders will be the best source of information if they survive the blast and if you have a method to receive information and listen to their directions. There was modeling done in New York City of a suitcase bomb, a suitcase nuclear device. And if people took simple steps like that, would save hundreds of thousands of lives. The problem is, if you see a nuclear blast in a mushroom cloud, is your instinct to go back in? No, right? It's to get the hell out of there as fast as you can, and you end up traveling with a lot of radioactive particles that you may be breathing in or breathing out or otherwise. Yeah. So that brings us into a lot of these cross-cutting threats and vulnerabilities. I know this is a little tough to see, but I'm gonna just sort of share a couple of things. So when we talk about this, why is this? So we deep dive into all these different areas of focus. Why is it so hard to be resilient? What are the root causes? What are the cross-cutting things? Do we have to plan for every single disaster we might face? And I think the short answer is no. This is a graphic, I wish it was mine, but it's from a colleague in Spain who presented it at a conference in Montreal on urban disaster resilience. And what you see is urban resilience, and what his team did is they did literature reviews of all these different definitions of resilience. And what you begin to find is resilience is not a moment in space and time. It's not a singular concept. It's the intersection of many different fields of analysis. There are planning components to it. Sustainable cities, urban design, urban planning. There are anthropological elements. What is our underlying psychology? How do we interpret risk? How do we interpret fear? Why is it that social distancing is followed and mask wearing is adhered to better in Santiago than in Dallas, Texas? There's underlying cultural identification, psychology, as well as a variety of others. There are ecological components, geographical, mechanical, and so resilience is really more of an intersection of many different perspectives. This is very fundamental to what we normally do. We take a very deterministic view of the world around us. There's an answer. That's how we teach science. True or false, A, B, C, D, or E. There's always a right answer. What's the right number? And you're shaking your head, absolutely. And yet, science teacher. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Yes. And especially I think when we get into university and when we get more, that's to think wider and to think about that. We're learning more and more that the world is more chaotic. It's not about, in a vacuum, what was the joke about the farmer who's having problems with a chicken, right? And then calls, he calls a bunch of people and finally calls a physicist, and the physicist looks at the chickens for a while, looks at the farmer, writes down some notes and says, I have an answer, but it only works for spherical chickens in a vacuum. Anyway, I'll actually tell one other. A colleague that at Columbia, Stuart Firestein, told me the story. I don't know the original source of it, about two brothers who had to write a report. about their pet for class. And they had the same teacher who taught 2 different grades. And the teacher, and so they both wrote about their pet dog. And the one brother goes into class, gets the paper, gets graded, everything's fine. The next brother goes in, gets the paper graded. Teacher tells him to come back after class. The brother comes up, and the teacher says, your paper was good, but it's exactly the same as your brother's. And he goes, well, ma'am, it's the same dog. Anyway, and of course, it's the intersection of these. It's how they interact with each other. And you have a package of solutions, but one solution may not work exactly the same in another context, right? And so understanding those dynamics and those influences. We work in fields of uncertainty. We work with probabilities rather than certainty. And I'm very glad to hear your perspective. And when we think of risk and resilience, so traditionally, a lot of the origins of disaster management is in continuity of government. It's in the first responder. It's a lot of consequence management is what we call it. But there's really, I'm not great at math, but I like this formula. And similar to my Spanish, I'm probably not as good at math because I just haven't applied myself consistently. Risk is the hazard times the vulnerability over the capacity to cope. So for the hazard, we have different threats, right? We've talked a lot here in Chile, wildfires, earthquakes, tsunamis, apparently now tornadoes, right? But we're talking with Onemi, right, about the concerns with landslides, with the rain that was coming. Vulnerability, what is the susceptibility to that, right? In an earthquake event, what building are you in? Has a lot to do with the situation. A colleague of mine in San Francisco says that an earthquake is a very non-hazardous event if you're in the middle of a field. If you're in the middle of Port-au-Prince with concrete construction without rebar, without reinforcement, it is one of the worst disasters in recorded history. Capacity to cope is this emerging area in the social sciences, is how different communities, I mentioned in the introduction, social capital and the connectedness, the ability to gather resources. Those who enjoy the benefits of civil society before a disaster are more likely to enjoy them after. And those who don't have access to it tend to suffer most and suffer the longest. And so when we're looking at disasters, we have to look at variables across the built environment, across response and recovery, across health and social aspects, across economic aspects. And this gets us to a place where a lot of our susceptibility to disaster, groups like, ONEMI and SHOA and FEMA in the United States and NOAA, are seen as the go-to for information on all of this. But our transportation policy, our economic development policy, our education policy, all of these things set the table for the consequences that need to be managed. So all of a sudden, groups and policies that seemingly have nothing to do with disasters have everything to do with disasters and everything to do with what's needed and how much is needed and what pressures are put on those agencies that have the mandate to respond to disasters. And so when we talk about this, how do we sort of rethink what we need? We think through we need more research. I know it's a little self-serving as a director of an academic institution to say we need more research, but I have data to support that. The bottom line is disaster science is very, very young. It's younger than psychology, and psychology was the baby until we came along. We don't even have good models of academia for it because it's an intersectional. It's not there's no single field. We have hazards research. We have environmental research, we have sociological research, and so it all has to come together, and so it's stretching academia, as is a variety of other kinds of, we're not looking to reduce it into its components, we're looking at the harmonics when you overlay these different sciences, what new insights are created. How do we really engage communities? This is something that is when we work with communities, it's a very profound question. I'm a white guy in a suit from an Ivy League academic institution. Hey guys, I'm going to come in and help you fix all your disasters down, right? There's some expertise that I can bring to the table, but at the same time, who am I to say that I understand what the community needs? So this is something we work on a lot, is where do we begin and end? We can go in, and the best way I can describe it is that, there's a buffet of options, but the community should decide what it wants to eat. And if it's not there, we need to figure out how to cook it. And this gets to that context factor. What works in one community may not work in another. The methods of COVID, social distancing, putting an app on everyone's phone in Korea to be able to track movement and give them alerts, never going to happen in the US. Never going to happen in a culture that's premised on individual freedom and privacy. So it's why, but too often we find, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a large institution of power, well-meaning, going into a community, and the engagement is actually, we came up with this idea, isn't it great? And so more pitching it to the community rather than truly co-developing. So I think there's a lot of work to do in that. Uncertainty, a lot of our methods of thinking, a lot of our methods of evaluation are based on very certain, and how do we build decision support frameworks that are based on uncertainty. Actually, it was very interesting, if I may, in our visit to CHOA in Valparaiso yesterday, looking at how with the uncertainty, and I remember you sharing with us, some things have more, the data just tells you, right? Other things, you're calling the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, you're calling other folks, and you're informing it with your expertise, but pulling in a lot of information to help sort of frame the uncertainty and frame that. Anyway, I don't mean to keep pointing to you, but I think it was a great example on how you're building systems that can accommodate uncertainty. They're not trying to force a decision or force certainty where it doesn't exist, but really trying to understand what those different data points are and what they're telling you about the situation. Our incentive structures are not really well wired for this. I talk a little bit about in this book. I have a book under review right now, it'll come out next year, deep diving specifically into this. So if you like this one, buy the next one. If you don't like this one, give me another shot when that one comes out. Okay, and finally, investing in the next generation. So that's one of the things we see. Everything that's happened, the loss of education for COVID, the loss of education in the Syrian refugee crisis, these are generations that have been left behind, generations that could potentially contribute. And finally, a lot of the ways we've been taught to think about things, we can leave behind better tools, better approaches, better education for the next generation, for the challenges that we'll inevitably leave behind. I want to just conclude with, I wanted to come back to COVID. And so my book was done in December of 2019. And we were getting all the proofs together and getting it all set up. And then the pandemic was occurring in the spring of 2020. I don't know if you guys knew this. There was a, yeah. And so there was this big question. What the hell do we do with a book about disasters that has a chapter on biothreats in the middle of what is going to be a prolonged global pandemic? Do we wait and rewrite it? And so ultimately what we did was wrote a preface to it. So talking about, because I didn't think anything really changed other than the ability to use that example. So I'm going to conclude just by reading sort of what was written in the spring of 2020 as we were preparing the final publication of the book. At the time this book is in production, the COVID-19 pandemic is ravaging the globe. And while this specific event occurred after the completion of the writing of this book, the underlying threats and vulnerabilities discussed could not be more relevant to the ongoing response, recovery, and prevention of this and future pandemics. The biothreats chapter covers how diseases with pandemic potential are emerging from the way we are developing and living our lives, especially as we are living in closer proximity to animal hosts of diseases. This is amplified by our global interconnectedness, which supports the rapid spread of disease. At the same time, we are slower to respond to biothreats because of insufficient early detection and intervention systems, as well as disparate authorities and inconsistent funding for public health and healthcare preparedness nationally and globally. Compounding this, global just-in-time supply chains make surging to the demands of a pandemic nearly impossible. We are experiencing all of this with the emergence of COVID-19, most likely from a live animal and seafood market in Wuhan, China, and rapid spread of the virus across the globe. Inefficiencies in testing, confusion among disaster authorities, and supply limitations are all playing out as expected and how our systems were destined to respond. There are silver linings, though. The limited public-private partnerships that have been built in anticipation of an emerging pandemic are making great strides in the development of countermeasures. And the sporadic surges in pandemic preparedness funding in years past have produced some planning templates to help guide our response. But we are not as prepared for this response as we should be, and the human and economic fallout will be felt for years to come. In addition to the threat from the pandemic itself, there are logistical issues with essential supplies such as protective equipment for frontline healthcare workers and medical equipment that will literally be the difference between life and death for many infected with this novel coronavirus. There are new pressures on our infrastructure as people fortunate enough to still be working are suddenly thrust into work from home settings, creating greater dependence on electronic communication systems. Disparities in access to the internet and reports of security intrusions into some of these systems highlight the strain on our infrastructure and our cybersecurity. This pandemic is also overlapping with increases in seasonal flooding and other extreme weather events. All of these threats are made more severe by climate change and our ongoing development in vulnerable areas. This potential for cascading disasters only increases the likelihood for mega disasters to form, as each disaster contributes to the severity of others happening simultaneously. And the duress of the COVID-19 pandemic on fragile nation states across the globe has also created new anxieties about broader instability among nuclear powers, and the potential for bad actors to exploit this crisis to do harm. But this book should not be viewed as a treatise on the events used to illustrate our underlying threats and vulnerabilities. It is more broadly about how we systematically contribute to these threats and vulnerabilities. We are suffering outsized impacts from COVID-19 because of a lack of preparedness for novel coronavirus. We are not suffering outsized impacts from COVID-19 simply because of a lack of preparedness for novel coronaviruses, but rather from oversimplifying and thus downplaying the threat of pandemics more generally, and through myopic development policies that don't adequately capture the complexity and uncertainty of the world we live in. There are undoubtedly more disaster events we could have cited, and there will be more in the future, but they all largely point to the same flaws in our thinking and limitations in our approaches to preventing and managing mega disasters. However, we do have the ability to rethink our readiness, and so we are prepared in the face of uncertainty. If we break the cycle of rigidity in our thinking and lean into the variability and complexity of the world we live in, we can build a more resilient and sustainable societies into the future. And so I don't leave you on a total bummer. I want to read the first paragraph in the conclusion section, because despite everything I've said for the last 45 minutes, I'm quite optimistic. The scope of the threats and vulnerabilities that are presented here may seem insurmountable, but there is reason for optimism. Never before have we had more knowledge of the world we live in and more resources at our disposal to build disaster resilience into our thinking about sustainable development. New perspectives on the role of research, the power of communities, and rethinking how we work with uncertainty are beginning to illuminate new strategies and approaches to the challenges we face. And the right investments with the right framing can benefit our resilience to disasters, as well as benefit broader society for generations to come. With that, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to eTrend and the Global Center.
Ahí sí, ¿sí? Bien. Hola a todos y a todas, bienvenidos, gracias por venir. Ahora lo que vamos a hacer es lo siguiente. Vamos a recibir preguntas del público que pueden ser en español o en inglés. Yo las puedo traducir si se sienten más cómodos en hacerlo en español. Y también yo traje algunas preguntas para conversar con Jeff. Así que mientras piensan sus preguntas, voy a tomar la oportunidad de partir yo.
Turn your head.
Oh. That's better? Yes, you can all hear me? Okay, so thank you, Jeff. I had the opportunity to read the book in advance. Yeah, no, don't worry.
Okay.
Actually, I'm taking my out, so
Okay.
that's also better. Yes,
Okay.
great.
Okay.
I had the opportunity to read this book. I highly recommend it. It's full of historical examples that I enjoyed and learned a lot. And it makes you realize that we're facing new challenges, but at the same time, a lot of the things we're facing happened before in a different scale. And I think your book, it's a lot about that, about the scale of threats and how we're all interconnected. So something happening in the other, like the other side of the world doesn't exist anymore, right? Because of the interconnections. And I'm gonna take the opportunity to ask the first question, and then we're gonna see what everyone has to say. And I really enjoy the chapter on infrastructure, and to see it in a disaster book, because it is it is different in the sense that we don't have an extreme phenomena as a trigger. Not necessarily, of course, a bridge can collapse because of a storm, but we've had cases when a bridge collapses without a storm, right? So it is a perfect example of how we're building our own disasters. And you talk a lot about how politicians like to cut ribbons, and it's always fancy to inaugurate a new building, but not to maintain. And my question is, don't you think that at universities, in academia, we kind of fell in the same trap? Because we also reward like innovation, and we call innovation this to build something new or to develop a completely new technology. And it's not fancy or fashionable to design an algorithm, for instance, to understand how to maintain a bridge or you know, like it. I want you to talk about that because you don't address it, like the responsibility that we have in this innovation culture that we build and share with our students. So I was wondering if you can comment.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and it's one we do a deep dive in. That my colleague Ellen Carlin and I are doing a deep dive in for the next book we're working on, really looking at sort of these business models. But I think to your point with academia, it's very similar in that the structures that have been built over hundreds of years have been focused on discovery, and not only focused on discovery, but on a very reductionist view of the world. We reduce it to its component parts, and we learn more about those component parts. And it's great if you're studying the physics of storm formation or how tectonic plates interact and learn something new about that. And whether or not that discovery leads to anything useful is kind of where a colleague in computer science said it best. He said, I only have to do it once to prove it can be done. It's up to industry to figure out how to make it work. But but I think that that's really important. We reward discovery, but discovery is generally defined as something new in the field. And when you have things like overlapping, like how do these two communities come together and work together on an earthquake detection system or on an evacuation planning, that's a very important thing that's celebrated among academics, but is not going to help you get tenure status. When you go before a tenure committee and you have an interdisciplinary paper with a lot of different authors that doesn't have a new discovery, just a novel application, it's not going to hold the same weight as if you discovered a new molecule or something like that. And I'm being overly simplistic, and I should say universities and the creation of the climate school at Columbia is a recognition of that there's another side of science. There's another where these different branches of science intersect and teach us something about the world we live in and an importance for relevance. So how do you protect really fundamental foundational research and discovery, how it's always been done, but also make a place that can create career paths that are connected to the world? I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the Earth Institute, which has turned into the climate school, having a pathway for doing that. When I even went up for my academic appointment, I had to get a waiver because I don't have a terminal degree, and I wasn't in the meeting because I wasn't allowed to be. But Erwin told me about it after. I hope I'm not violating university protocol here by talking about this. Anyway, and you know, the question came up, you know, there aren't a lot of peer-reviewed publications in high-impact journals. And it was a good question, and it was a fair question, and to this day, I'm grateful to Erwin because he gets it and he understood, and he said, look, you know, the work has been presented before Congress, taken meetings at the White House, directly informed policy. I mean, the impact is quite substantial. It just doesn't match the metrics. And because we were at the Earth Institute at the time, there was an area in the academic promotion metrics that actually accommodated practice and impact that doesn't exist in a lot of other areas. Right. So it's a, I don't mean to be overly critical of universities. It's a model that we're all struggling to evolve into the world that we're in, while not throwing out all of the important aspects of it. But I think it's something that we're right in the middle of right now. And some are further along than others, but I don't think anyone's cracked the code.
Right. And especially in the terms of like maintenance. I thought a lot about that after reading. Like, if I don't know any academics who say like, what do you do your research on? Like maintenance. Yeah. Like, right? It wouldn't be fashionable at all, but then it is so important. Yeah. Right? We had this contest, innovation contest with students for heat. Yeah. And all the time I was thinking like, some student could just bring a tree, you know, because you have all these technologies to maintain a city, you know, in a good temperature. But none of these technology is going to be better than just plant a tree. But then who is going to win the contest with a tree, right? That is not like a technological development.
I'll give you another example. When Zika virus was emerging in the United States, there was I think it was several $1 billion that were allocated for Zika response, and a big chunk of it was for vaccine development. When I was on a call at the White House, it wasn't just me and them, there were 300 of us. So I want to sound impressive, but not too impressive. Yeah, and someone asked the question, how long until a vaccine is widely available? And Anne Schuchat from the CDC, who recently retired, gave a very, very good response on all of the complexities and variabilities. But the answer was somewhere between 18 months and never. And just the day before, or sometime before, I'd read an article in Florida, and I forget which county it was, had one part-time mosquito abatement official. And I thought, well, hell, for $65,000 a year plus benefits, we could double the capacity of preventing Zika virus in this one community. And yet the whole conversation was on this massive multi-billion-dollar, highly risky investment that would only essentially be functional against one. And these same mosquitoes carry dengue, they carry chikungunya, they carry other things. And so, but that wasn't where policymakers wanted to go. That was boring.
Yeah, and policymakers and I think academics also, like to invent a vaccine, it's wow. Yeah. Like, you have the latest development to organize killing mosquitoes. It may not be as fashionable.
Well, and failed research is useful. Like if someone tries something and it doesn't work, I want to know about it. But how are you going to publish? That's hard to publish. We need
the journal of failed research.
That's right. We need, yeah.
There's a
hi, Jeff. Hey, here, David. I haven't introduced myself. Sure. All the things you're talking about is something that currently appears in a class of 13, 14 year old students. They ask the same questions. They don't have to be at the university to have curiosity. And as the new generations are changing, also the Chilean curriculum is changing.
Yes.
In the last 10 years, all the model of education has changed a lot, from passing the passive lecture to project-based learning. The student create, students perform, do the presentation. There are no tests, there are no true false, there are no A, B, C, D.
Yeah.
At least in my classroom, I take the risk.
Yes.
I take I know there is a hazard involved in teaching these things to young people, but they're eager to learn. So how would I say no?
Yeah.
And by when then they are 16, 17 years old, they change the subject for natural science to science for citizenship. So the projects are community-based. And last year, I received a lot of themes from the projects that were about resilience and many things that are going, by example, the high school was located, or is located in the commune of Lampa, north here, and there was at least 10 projects that were relative to drought.
Yes.
Or wildfires, or the problem with the water contamination. It was amazing. Those kids were so focused in their environment, while me as a teacher, and that's about going wrong in your hypothesis, so they were more interesting in being an influencer in Instagram.
Yes.
But no, they were really interested in the real world.
Yes.
And that was really surprising. So about the question, in the diagram you proposed that wasn't yours, there was a side of social sciences.
There is.
I see anthropology, but I don't really, myself, I think education is a science.
Yes.
But there are some people who deny that education is just a method.
Yeah.
For
yeah.
me, it's a science. I'm eager to know how my students learn. So I formulate hypotheses on their learning, and they receive some data that proves me wrong or not. So the way ecology is taught by now depends on a model that comes out from Greece, that a human is separated from nature.
Yep.
But it's actually not.
Mm-hmm.
Human is part of the nature. So changing this model, I think, maybe I may be wrong, or do you think you have an opinion on that? That changing that from the very first years of school or even preschool,
Yes.
to help the students learn this idea that we're part of the nature, that we're part of the nature, that we are not separated, will help in these matters on preparedness. So be prepared from the first years, then wait for the political or the governance
Yeah.
to take decisions. That's it. Sorry for the long.
No, it is
context.
absolutely wonderful. It sounds like you're doing amazing work right in the line of what we need to be doing, which is introducing these things early on. I love this idea too, as humans are part of the natural environment. I think what we were talking at dinner, everything is technically organic, but anyway, yeah. But to your point, I think that's exactly what's needed, is that we have multiple ways of looking at the world, and it's not that one is right and one is wrong, it's that we're only choosing to teach one or a small set of those. And actually, you bring up here with the graphic, so one of the flaws with this graphic is it's searching the literature for definitions of resilience, which means the only definitions you're getting are those that have been published on and will show up in a search. You don't see the humanities in here, which is a huge part of that connection from the spiritual to the physical world, and cultural identity, and some amazing work being done. I'm biased, I was a theater major in my undergrad. But also education. So our deputy director, Tom Chandler, is from a PhD in education, and our colleague, Josh DiVincenzo, who you'll be meeting with in Bali, sorry, we're making a connection, they're gonna both be in Indonesia at the same time, is actually doing a lot of work around research around how we learn, and has some great papers out about, and I agree, it's missing. It's just, there's no other way around it. How we learn about things has a lot to do with how we should be teaching them, and how we teach climate change is not well matched to how we learn and how we interpret and how we process information. And so there's some amazing work being done there. And to your point too, I'm actually working through a process of sort of explaining why the educational research is part of the disaster research, and connecting those dots and explaining it with things like our provost office. And I'm not being critical, it's just, it's a reminder that we have these mental models we're stuck on, and sometimes we take for granted as we're working at these intersections of different sciences that not everyone else is too. Long-winded way of saying I couldn't agree with you more. And I think these frontiers and expanding this, we need mechanisms that incentivize the expansion of this, because there's a lot of lessons, a lot of clues. And honestly, it blew my mind, and hearing about like sort of how we teach and how people learn, and what an essential prerequisite that is before we start pushing information into the classroom. One other piece, just very briefly, your point of experiential learning. We had within the climate school, the first class, too, a strong appetite among the students to get beyond the quantitative and into case studies and into actual practice and things like that. I think there is still a need, don't get me wrong, we still need to be built on an empirical process where we can test assumptions and remove our biases from them. I do see a little bit of danger in backing into preconceived conclusions of advocacy driving research, rather than really being open to the true complexity of the discovery. But that's the problem I want to have, not the problem of not asking the questions and not doing it. So yeah, sorry, I had a long-winded answer. So
There's another question there. 2 questions, good.
Jeff, 2 small questions. One of them is missing in that diagram. One of the key components of the crisis management, which I do, which is communications. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it is there, but I can't read everything. So it may be there somewhere.
Oh, then it is. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
So the way to communicate when you have a problem or this disaster, the way to move people around and everything should be, I think, there somewhere.
Yeah.
That's one of the things. The other one is that You talked about the internet, and
Yes.
and I haven't realized how dangerous it is not to have internet connection every single minute for us in our lives, to buy, to move, to take transport, to whatever you do. So, what is the real risk? What do you think there? You say there's bits and pieces. It's not one big thing, but I have a thought. Maybe I'm wrong. That with September 11, somehow the U.S. said, let's take the pill down and forget about internet for a while where the planes were flying. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I heard. Can you develop a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think the use of, and I'll extend a little bit into social media, and I love the point too on communication, because that's a whole nother, we have a number of folks, journalists who have worked with communication and how people, actually did a lesson in my class on communications and spent some time on media as well as kind of the cognitive aspects. But I think to your point with the internet, so there's a great book, has nothing to do with disasters, by James Glick, who's written a lot about on chaos theory and things like that, called The Information. And in it, he kind of talks about the history of information and how we have these evolutionary cycles where information becomes so complex, we have to develop a method of categorizing it. So there came a point where physical gestures weren't enough, so we had to create language. And then language wasn't enough, so we had to create writing. And so you have these points in evolution where the world becomes so complex and communication becomes so complex that you need to create a new mechanism for managing and coordinating it. I think we're at one of those thresholds with big data and with the internet and with the connection. I don't know if I can give a satisfactory answer, so maybe I'll say a few things and see if one of them lands. It's so new and it's so outpaced our paradigms for, I mean, it's not brand new, it's been around for a while, but we look at the web and then we look at the web 2.0, we look at user-generated content. We look at, you can look at Facebook or Twitter or whatever and see what's going on, but because it's so unregulated, it can also be exploited. The algorithms are driven not towards getting the truth, but towards getting engagement and towards getting clicks. And we've learned some very terrible things about the algorithms, and I would argue about our own psychology as well too, how we're attracted to more extremist views and how it draws us more that way as we do it. And then we rely on the internet for these connections, for communication. And when it goes away, does that cut us off from the world? And so I think, I don't have a good answer other than I think in general, the connectivity that the internet creates is a net positive. I think particularly during the pandemic, the ability to be physically distant but not socially distant is really a big part of what's gotten us through it. It's democratized information in a way that's been very difficult to do through traditional media as it's been consolidated. At the same time, it's more open to exploitation, it's more open to malfeasance. And when we lose it, do we still know how to communicate with each other through other means? And if we talk tactical communications, if we lose the internet, do we have old school radios to be able to talk to each other? If the cellular networks go down, are there landlines that are able to connect? So it's part of the whole cybersecurity and infrastructure. I went back and forth whether to include both of those chapters as one or separate them. And I kept cybersecurity separate just because it was so complicated in its own right. I wanted to do a deeper dive around that. I don't know if I said anything that was even close to answering your question, but that's those are my thoughts.
She has a question.
Great.
Okay, hello? Sí. Actually, I have two. You were talking about investments, but we're clear that we're in a tight pocket situation in the wake of the pandemic, and in Chile's case specifically, there are demands for higher spending on social programs. How do we finance all of these preparations in a context in which public resources are already stretched thin? And the other question I have is, you were mentioning the necessity to approach communities, and in Chile just elected regional governors for the first time last year, but we were still discussing what attributions they should have. What role do you think these offices should have in terms of investments for disaster readiness? And is there any positive examples you can think of?
Yeah, I think I'll work backwards. So I think in terms of engaging communities, it's an investment in time and resources. And again, this sort of gets to the investment structure. We had a project that we're fortunate to have funded for multiple years up front with a lot of flexibility. So we were able to spend a year getting to know communities and work with them and hear their concerns before we were really pressured to show results and show outputs. And so there's a little bit of rethinking on what it means to engage communities, and that can run afoul of election cycles and earnings reports and things like that. It just takes time, and it takes money. And so I think also meeting people where they are is really important, and meeting people where they are in depth. We budget on our community-based work to have multiple trips and extended trips to really spend time, but also to bring them. If we go to Washington to talk to Congress, we bring them to talk in their own words about it. So there are little gestures that are incredibly important, and going in sort of with an open mind. So I don't know the specific mechanics. It'll be different in different areas, but I think those values and those principles and those investments are really important in terms of meaningfully engaging communities. And to your question on investments, what I would say too is, I don't think we value investments properly. I think the way we determine the value of investments misses a lot on the value of resilience. We're engaged in some projects right now. I keep pointing to my colleague Antonia Samur, who's based here in Chile as well too, and leads a lot of our amazing community-based work and is working with us on some of our value of resilience work. And so, some of the work we're doing now with utilities, if we make this investment in reliability, what is the direct trade-off for that? That's a good question, but a better question is, what is this going to mean in terms of reduced health impacts from outages? What is this going to mean in terms of more economic development activity because of reliable power? And getting back to that, risk is times vulnerability, hazard times vulnerability over capacity to cope. A power outage of an hour affecting 1,000 people here in this part of Santiago is probably a very different scenario than, a day of outage or 2 days of outage in another part of Santiago, in a more impoverished area, a more disconnected area. So the value of the same investment, if we're only measuring it by hours and customer hours interrupted, it looks like the same investment. But if we look at the societal value, it's tremendously different. It's tremendously more valuable in these other contexts. So I think that we have to accept that the way we look at investments it undervalues resilience, and it also undervalues the risks that we put in place. We're going to build this building here because it hasn't flooded in 30 years. Well, the climate change projections say it's more likely to flood in the next, you know what I mean, things like that. So I think we really have to get into the math and rebuild the formulas we use for valuing that. Sure.
Thank you, Jeff. Another thing you mentioned in your book about what she was asking is that when we work on poverty and inequality, we are working on resilience. Yes. So you don't have to think about this as competing factors, because when you are reducing poverty or reducing inequalities, you are working towards resilience. And then there's, of course, the enormous amount of money we need for infrastructure. And I think the point you just made about how when reliance on networks has a value not only in the moment of a shock, but also people can make better decisions if they have trust in their systems. Mm-hmm. Like you will have heating with electricity instead of a chimney or whatever, because the electricity system is reliable. So that will have another impact, right? Like mm-hmm. positive externalities in the health of the people who live there. Another thing I wanted to ask you is that in your book, you comment a lot on something that is pretty obvious, but I fear that those of us who work on disaster, we have forgotten about it a little bit, and it's that the result of a disaster depends on many things, right? Of course, it depends on mitigation, preparation, but it also depends on the response, like what happens in the precise moment when you get the shock. Yes. Right? And I feel that it is fancier today in disaster studies to focus on what you do before, right? To be prepared, because of course it is important, and I'm not saying it's not, it's crucial that you mitigate, it's crucial that you prepare. But I don't think we have enough research, and this is a question actually, do we have enough research on how to make the best decisions, how to approach the moment of emergency?
Yeah, so I would say generally no, although there are specific areas where that answer is yes. So when we're looking at specific hazards, specific tactics, I think there's enough research. Whether or not we apply it is different.
Right.
But yeah, so there are specific, like what's the best way to evacuate a building? Like that's a clear yes. What is the right mix of doing drills and things like that? So some things that are more discrete and very easy to sort of contain actually work very well. But then when we get into kind of broader preparedness, and even, you know, in the US after 9/11, it was build a preparedness kit. And preparedness as a nation was measured by how many people had preparedness kits. There was no research actually suggesting that that improved outcomes after a disaster. And it's only very recently, like literally in the last year, that there have been publications coming out actually empirically analyzing this. And, you know, of course, you know, in research, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It probably does help. But the question is that, you know, billions in preparedness campaigns and efforts were all premised on this emergency kit. And then it was really the social sciences and looking at social capital that said, you know, it may be a better investment to have a block party and
Right.
meet with your neighbors than to put a preparedness kit together. And of course, what we're finding is that there are preparedness assets that are useful. But the ideal makeup of that kit, what should be in it, it was very much based on logic and what people thought was right. I'll give an example. I was doing an interview. I can't believe they let me talk to the media still. But anyway, they were saying that I wasn't able to say what I wanted to say, so I'm going to tell you now what I wanted to say. The question was, I was talking to the reporter, and they were saying, oh, well, we talked to this firefighter that said that you should have a hatchet, an axe, in your preparedness kit in case your house floods and you need to cut your way out of your attic to be on your roof. And I forget what I said. But what I didn't say was that if you find yourself in a flood event and you have to hack your way onto your roof, you have had about 20 different failures of preparedness in terms of evacuating, in terms of listening. Like, to me, it was like, don't put the energy in the axe. Put the energy in listening to this, understanding your hazards. Like, there's 1,000 other things that are far more useful than having an axe. Okay, fine, throw an axe on top of the pile just in case. Okay, fine. Now, the last thing I want is for someone to not be able to hack their way out of their roof. But and I'm not trying to victim blame or anything like that. But that's such an easy answer. And after Katrina, there were a lot of people who were stuck in their roofs and couldn't hack their way out. But I think it completely misses the point on the underlying vulnerability,
Right.
as well as the mistrust in the messaging for the areas that didn't evacuate. So yes, there are some physical elements of preparedness. There are some very sort of discrete pieces that are easy to define and measure that we have a lot of research on. But these broader sort of questions and these broader interactions, I think we do need a lot more information on. And we're starting to get it. But it's also something where, you know, as universities, I think we have a lot to do to build more sustained programs in disaster research to help build out the picture a bit better.
Right. And, Pauline, you have a question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Pauline Claremont. I'm an urban planner. I had the possibility to study at Columbia, so an alumni as well. Thanks for the presentation and for putting all those concepts together and resources. I think it's a great, informing book. My question comes from working in the private sector, especially in infrastructure. So we get to see a lot of, engineering challenges, but
Yes.
at the same time, I do the community outreach part, so we see all the communities and the impact. So this presentation really touches that point. All those things are in the same space, happening at the same time. And I really would like to hear if you can expand a little more about the rewiring incentives piece
Yeah.
of the book. I think that's something that we really need to do. And if you have any example on that,
Sure.
especially with the public sector and private sector.
Yeah. So I think so one example on the financial side is you hear a lot about ESG bonds, right? Environmental, social, and governance, and these are sort of designed to sort of rewire and start looking at more societal benefits and things like that. If you look at the impacts of climate change and climate-driven disasters, a lot of that is accounted for under the E in ESG. But it's not accounted for in the social and the governance structures. And we know that the impacts from disasters can dramatically impact social networks and impact governance in ways that can significantly benefit or hurt the response to a disaster. Similarly, with a lot of risk management, increasingly we're seeing climate change projections being used, but most risk is defined by looking historically. And because you have to model things into the future, and we're not comfortable with models. So I think a lot of the incentive structures are based on sort of very narrow definitions of risk that don't take into account sort of broader societal risk. And what was the other area you asked me about? Oh, yeah. I think with
because like most of our contracts, we have like a very low budget, for community outreach in the community piece of the project, and it's mostly about engineering.
Yeah, and it's always been, and to be honest, it's oftentimes, I mean, just in my experience, it can be an adversarial relationship. You want to do something that's going to be very disruptive to the community ecosystem. And there's really two ways to do it. You can try and cut it short and get in there as aggressively and quickly and cleanly as possible. And that's where most of our incentives sort of drive us towards, is let's get this done by this deadline. I have quarterly earnings report. The election is in 2 years, and I want to make sure that people are happy when they go to the polls. It's worth noting in the political science, at least in the United States, about every $25,000 or so that you spend on disaster recovery will buy you an additional vote. So spending money on recovery is extraordinarily rewarded. There is no correlation with preparedness. Even though we know it saves all kinds of money, right? Down in this particular study, it was $1 saved 12 within the election cycle, 15 overall. And voters don't care, which I think gets to an educational and a communications component as well too. Are we getting the message out there? And so the strategy may less be about beating up politicians and more about going more upstream of the incentive structure and rewiring it from there. But yeah, I think with community engagement, so it's the incentives drive us more towards being more quickly and engaging less, doing what's required, doing the required regulatory hearing. It can be done over a longer term. There was actually, so in Japan, after the Kobe earthquake, here's kind of an extreme example for disaster recovery. They put a moratorium on new construction for 6 months. Now, I have mixed feelings on whether or not slowing the recovery, what that does to mental health and moving on and things like that. But the point that was being made was that we really want to get community engagement. If we're going to rebuild, we want to do this thoughtfully. We want to do this the right way. And so it was a very interesting approach. And so I think there's just getting back to the research, there's so much we don't know. Like, it's like if we look at a screen, we have like a handful of pixels that are really well illuminated and then just blank space in between. So there's just a lot we don't know. But I think the answer to community engagement is going slower and more methodically. But that is completely contrary to the incentives and the funding. I should also say too, it's not lost on me the importance that economic health drives the ability to underwrite resilience. And so I'm not just saying you have to be competitive in a global marketplace. You have to be able to bring in the revenue to be able to afford to do these things. And this is something we can't really reconcile, that the direction of investments in resilience, unless we actually better articulate the value in economic terms and in monetary terms, which we're working on.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Pauline, for your question. Is there more questions? There's one more question.
Hi, I came from the...
Un momento.
Better. It is about the approach for the private companies,
Yes.
because it's part of the community. But when you talk with clients, they see these topics very, very interested. But always, majority of companies don't do nothing. Prefer put money in other
Yes.
things. And do you have a good example of some companies that their risk reduction is taken seriously? Can you share with us?
Yeah, so there's a couple, and we're involved with a few as well too, with on the utility side as well as with some financial advisory firms. And I think that we're seeing more and more involvement of corporations, partly because of the impacts of climate change and partly because of the pandemic. There's actually data now that I've heard, but I haven't seen, that companies that have invested in employee wellness programs and sick time and things like that actually outperformed their competitors. I'm like, that's great. We need more studies like that because that's going to strike right to it. There was one group that we were talking with a number of years ago. It was a global beverage firm, and they were looking at their corporate social responsibility investments, and they knew that the community was the context in which they worked within, and if the community couldn't function after a disaster, their business couldn't function. So there was a humanitarian and a capitalistic, sort of like there was an overlap in the altruism and the capitalism Venn diagram. That's what they were looking at, and they were looking at an index of what were the countries that were more prone to natural hazards and also had less capacity to respond. An example of that was Zimbabwe. A lot of problems with the government there, very prone to disasters, and operations could be very much affected. And so in investing in resilience and investing in community projects, that would likely be a priority because it would have an additional benefit to the community that would also match some of those incentives. So I think those are interesting examples. We've sort of seen a range of both contracts with us to help better define resilience and define it more into the community, as well as corporate social responsibility and more grants for a lot of our community-based work. And it seems to be growing. There seems to be more interest, which is great. Whether that represents a broader shift in the private sector or more people are aware of us, I can't say for sure. And the other thing I would mention is at the end of the day, like the private sector, depending on where you're at, is 80, 90% of the response and recovery infrastructure in a given area. It may be led by the government, it may be coordinated by the government, but most of the capacity, most of the manufacturing, most of what's needed is sitting in the private sector. So there's an incredible amount of need to not just look at disasters as a government problem or a humanitarian organization problem. That being said, even the most generous of private sector organizations are ultimately accountable to shareholders, are ultimately accountable to certain incentives. So you may have a board that is very generous, you may have investors that are willing to take less of a market return, but there'll always be a need to sort of understand where the private sector just isn't going to go, and government needs to be there, and the nonprofits need to be there. That being said, if we can better define those boundaries, if we can get the private sector to do more in resilience, that'll free up government resources for those areas where it's needed most. Sounds very elegant in concept. In practice, I have no idea how to do it. But with additional funding, we could, okay, no one, okay. Anyway, no, but it's all, I think, just parts of the puzzle that we're all working on.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm constantly reminded of some friends who work in the IT sector, security. They have a thankless job where if nothing happens, they're doing their job, but nobody knows about it.
Yes.
And when an emergency happens, they get the blame.
Yeah.
And you've
It's
mentioned...
the same with risk management.
Absolutely.
If no one knows who you are, you're doing your job perfectly.
Exactly. And you've mentioned that doing maintenance is not sexy. It's not exciting. You've mentioned also that $1 spent today saves $12 to $15 down the road. And I want to go back to he left. Yeah. But he mentioned the communication there. If you had to say 2 or 3 main communication points, how can politicians, how can people who work in this sector get the word out to the people that what we're doing is of absolute importance? And what you may not see it today, but it's saving us all this heartache and all this disaster. We're avoiding disaster in the future.
This is one of the toughest things, and I started my career in this space in public health, which is very similarly. You always want to cut public health funding when disease rates are low, and and then you see the consequences of the diminished infrastructure, and you can't just surge it back up. So it's a lot of fields I think have this conundrum. But to your point, in terms of communication, so first and foremost, what politicians do with regards to disasters is they frame it. They frame the urgency. Is this something we need to be worried about or not? Is this a priority or not? Is this an all-out? And this is something in the early days of COVID. How worried should we be? And even to this day, and in the US in particular, there's one political party that's saying, it was nothing and never was anything despite 1 million dead in the country. So it's anyway, don't get me down that road. Anyway, but so I think there's a responsibility there. I think there's a responsibility for leaders within communities. But I'd also say too, when it comes to communication, it needs to come from a variety of sources. I'll give an example. In Arkansas, there was a smart 911 system, emergency response system when you call the emergency number, right? And they wanted everyone to sign up for it. And there were a number of families from Mexico, and some were there legally, others were undocumented. And so the police officer and an agent of the government was there saying, let's, we really want you to sign up. Great. And then the police officer was actually later contacted by one of the pastors in the church and said, hey, a lot of folks are coming up to me and asking me about this. So they had come from the meeting and went to their pastor and said, can I trust this? Is this for real? So where information comes from, sometimes they want to hear it from an academic, sometimes people want to hear it from a doctor, sometimes they want to hear it from a friend. And actually some of the behavioral sciences shine a lot of light. And a lot of times you want to hear it from multiple sources. So I think that there's a shared responsibility for this, but it definitely starts with leadership because they have the most immediate platform to frame this as something that's important and frame it as something to say exactly what you've just said, that we enjoy the benefits of this when we're able to forget about it.
Thank you, Jeff. I think we're on time, right? It's 10:30 to 10:42. So I want to thank Jeff. He's going to be here for 10 more days or so, 8 days. So we're really thankful for your visit. And I want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And encourage you to read the book. I really enjoy it. There's so many other things that we didn't discuss today, but you can read it and wait for the next book too. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of you too. I mean, I get to sit up here on stage, but I'm really just in awe of all the work that I've seen so far. And I know I'm meeting with a lot of folks, so just thank you. I appreciate everything you're doing.